applying for grants, and we have a grants committee. Yeah. ¿Tú me dices cuándo? ¿No? Sí. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the Columbia Global Center in Santiago. My name is Antonio Campaña. I'm the director of the center. It is a pleasure to be with you today, especially because Dr. Sandra Matz will be presenting a most interesting topic. Before I let Francisca introduce Dr. Matz, just a brief words on the Santiago Center. The Santiago Center is a part of a network of 11 worldwide centers that serve Columbia University's physical and intellectual gateway to the world. The Santiago Center is committed to sharing Columbia's remarkable scholarship, expertise, and resources to address global challenges and inspire intellectual and discussions worldwide. Over the years, the Santiago Center has positioned itself as an intellectual bridge between academic communities. It enables knowledge sharing and facilitates research projects on relevant global and local public policy topics, such as climate change, responsible mining, journalism, humanities, global health, and education. For the last 5 years, the Santiago Center has organized over 300 public activities to address emerging issues and challenges through a multidisciplinary approach. It has also sponsored research projects focusing on critical public issues such as the sciences, culture and the arts, education, and public health, among other fields. The center actions have had relevant implications for advancing knowledge and public debate in the region and promoting collaboration between Colombia and Chile. It is also focused on climate change, public health, and issues of public relevance, such as energy transition and critical minerals. So again, thanks so much for being here. I'd like to introduce Francisca Lun, Columbia Business School Alumni Club Leader, who will be introducing Dr. Sandra Matz.
Here. That's great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Antonio said, my name is Francisca Lund. I am a Columbia Business School graduate class of 2015 and member of the Columbia Business School Alumni Board here in Chile. And I am very excited to have the chance to introduce you to Professor Matz. Sandra Matz is the David W. Zalasnik Associate Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and co-director in the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. Well, she received her PhD from the Cambridge University, and she's a computational social scientist that combines a background in psychology and computer science. And she has uncovered the hidden relationship between psychology and our digital footprint. I don't want to mix the words. With the goal to improve individuals or help individuals and businesses make better decisions and more ethical ones. Her work has been covered by several news outlets like the New York Times, the BBC, CNBC, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and we are very lucky to have her here today. And the most exciting news is that she is launching in January 2025 her new book entitled Mindmasters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior, in which she discusses how algorithms can penetrate our psychology through data analysis and how that can help us or could also hurt us, and how to um, overcome or how to make the data ecosystem more equitable. So I invite you all to participate in the conversation. We're going to start with a presentation from Professor Matz around, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, and then open to Q&A. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you want to ask. And thank you so much again, Professor Matz, for being here in Chile with us.
Thank you so much.
I think this we need for the millions of people watching online. So, but yeah, so if you have, like, I'm just going to give you a broad overview of essentially what's in the book, which is really covering is now more than 10 years of research that I've been doing in the field. But if you have questions throughout, right, just I think it can be totally more of a conversation. So don't think that you have to wait for me to finish the 20 minutes, the 20, 30 minutes before you jump in. It's like amazing to have an IT person here. So thank you so much. I think all of it is, I mean, you've all been to classes. This is the one thing that's missing, right? You start the class and it's always like a short IQ test to kind of see if you can get the slides up and the microphone working. So thank you so much for being my IQ person here. Let me see if this, maybe I have to click on it. Yeah, and I can do it. Okay. I thought I was going to start here. This is also where the book starts, and I don't think any of you will recognize this because this is a village in the southwest corner of Germany where I grew up. It has 500 people, whereas my parents remind me, I think by now it has 1,000, which I can assure you is not making much of a difference. So my experience of growing up in that place was really the fact that, you know, you have like 500 neighbors and they know everything about you, right? They see you running to the bus, they figure out that you might be a little bit more disorganized than the typical German person, and they know exactly who you mingle with, who you meet, what you do in your free time, what you want to do after school. And for me, on some that was actually that meant two things. On the one hand, it was amazing, right? So you have this community that understands you really well, that knows where you want to be in the future, and that can offer the most amazing support and advice that you can hope for because they've seen you grow up for 18 years. But it also meant that it was just incredibly annoying. So you have 500 other people that are just interfering with your life because they know where you want to be and what your preferences are. So the way that I talk about this, the research that I've been doing for the last 10 years in the book is essentially saying, to what extent is this experience that I had growing up in the village not too dissimilar from what we experience today in the digital world, right? So it's not necessarily that you have your neighbors looking over your shoulder 24/7, tracking every step that you take and interfering with your life, but you leave all of these data traces, which means that anyone who has access to, let's say, your social media data, credit card spending, your smartphone that you carry with you pretty much 24/7, right, knows exactly where you are at any given point in time, potentially who you meet, because that's two phones showing up in the same place at the same time, more often than not. So that gives an incredibly intimate picture into your preferences, your habits, your routines, and as I'm going to show you in a little bit, also your psychology. So it's really not just the data traces that we're talking about, but it's these inferences that we can then make about the person who's behind the data. And it's something that I've termed psychological targeting. There's many different ways in which people have been talking about this, but what I'm going to talk about both here and in the book is essentially to what extent can we make inferences about people's psychology based on their data, and then to what extent can we use these insights that we have people to change the way that they think, feel, and behave, right? So it's not just that we're trying to peek into someone's psychology, but oftentimes the goal of that, the same way that my neighbors were trying to interfere with my life in the village, is to kind of push people in a certain direction when it comes to purchase, voting, whatever you want to accomplish. And for all of the computer nerds in the room, if you think about like Web 1 and 2, it's essentially like reading and writing, right? So the first step is like, can we read someone's mind based on their data? And the second part is more like, can we also then write into someone's mind? So can we change the way that they think, feel, and ultimately behave? And we're obviously going to talk about what does that mean, right, in terms of opportunities and challenges. So there's three main questions that I'm briefly going to go through. This is also the way that I talk about it in the book. The first one is, how does it work, right? I think there's been a bunch of talk, and I'm going to come back to this later, in the context of scandals like Cambridge Analytica, that was like the company that claimed to have influenced the 2016 presidential election by tapping into people's psychology. And the question is like, how would they do that? And does it actually work? And the second one is, so what? Once I can tap into your psychology, what power does that give me? And then the final one is really the one that I probably care about the most, which is the what now, right? Once we have established that the ability to get your data, look into your personality, change your behavior, how should we be thinking about this in terms of regulation, in terms of oversight and guardrails? Okay, starting with the first one. So as a psychologist, most of what we do is essentially trying to understand human behavior, right? Can we measure what's going on in someone's mind? And the way that we used to do this traditionally was essentially based on self-reports, right? I'm sure that many of you have taken one of these questionnaires in one form or another, either in the context of an interview, a job interview, or like one of these fun quizzes on Facebook, like which Game of Thrones character are you, which is maybe like a little bit less scientific, but they all based on the same idea. So we give you a statement, it says like, I talked to a lot of different people at parties, and then we ask you for your self-assessment, right? If you say strongly agree, you're probably more extroverted, and then the average person, if you say strongly disagree, you're probably more introverted. Very easy way for scientists to get at like your self-perception and your personality, because we can just sit you down for 20 minutes, you complete the questionnaire. You can imagine that it's not really useful when it comes to applications, right? So when it comes to, let's say, marketers trying to understand your psychology and then give you the most relevant ad, they can't have you complete a questionnaire for 20 minutes and then figure out that you're more extroverted and then surface the most relevant ad. So one of the things that, and this is a development, I would say, over the last 15 years or so now. So instead of asking you questions, we can essentially just observe your data, right? I can ask you, to what extent do you socialize with other people? Or I can just see, how often do you go to bars? How often are you in environments where there's a lot of other people around? And we can get this from, again, smartphones, for example, where we see how many other people are around. Is there ambient noise? Are you in a public location that we know is associated with a lot of activity? Most of this is driven by machine learning, AI. I'm going to tell you a little bit more later. I don't want to go into technical details. If anyone has questions after, I'm super happy to talk about it, but I don't think that's going to be the most interesting part. But I do want to give you some examples, because I think the examples really nicely highlight how what someone does online directly translates into something that is deeper on a psychological level. So here's some of my favorite work. That was also really one of the early work where they looked at, so those are some of my colleagues at Cambridge, and they looked at the words in people's Facebook status updates, and how those are related to some of the personality traits that we know actually generalize across cultures, across languages. And here what they showed is like extroverted, the stuff that extroverted people talk about makes a lot of sense, right? If you're extroverted, you're social, you're outgoing, you have like parties, weekends, amazing. So they're just out and about doing their thing. If you contrast that, and that's usually the nice comparison to people who are much more introverted and reserved. So people who prefer to spend time by themselves, you have stuff like anime, manga, internet, Pokemon, computer. You don't need other people to do this stuff, right? You can happily do this at the comfort of your own home. Here's my favorite one, just because I think it's so telling. So this is another personality trait. It's called agreeableness, and it's people who are caring, trusting, empathetic. So it's like, think of it as social glue of society. And it literally has like this warm glow, right? So people talk about Thanksgiving, amazing, blessed, wonderful. So they're just grateful for life. Word of warning, the one for people who are disagreeable. So those are people who are more critical and competitive. It's very different. It's essentially just a whole bunch of swear words. What I should say, and that's important, first of all, we're not cherry picking, right? We're not going into the data to kind of see, oh, this would make for a fun word cloud. And it also doesn't mean that people who are disagreeable swear all the time. So those are just correlation and probabilities. It just means that if you happen to swear on Facebook, chances that you're also somewhat more critical and competitive is just much higher. And the reason for why I like these word clouds is I think it just shows that it's not rocket science, right? So oftentimes you have people in machine learning AI and it's like, oh, it's this black box. We don't really know what it's doing. You're counting words here and you're literally calculating a correlation. It's pretty easy to figure out what's going on here. You can do the same thing with Facebook likes, and that's going to become relevant a little bit later on when I talk about some of the applications. But you see the same, and what I should say is when I talk about likes, I don't mean your friend posts a video and you like it. Those ones are just official pages. So if you follow the official page of Lady Gaga, this would show up here. And again, it has the same pattern, right? So extroverts talk about all of the social stuff that you do with other people, and introverts, all of the things that you typically do by yourself. Here's one that I think is also very telling, and again, just has really good face validity. This is neuroticism or emotional stability. So the extent to which people regulate and manage their emotions. You have people who are super stable, nothing can shake them on the one hand. And then you have people who are somewhat more volatile in their emotions. And you literally see this, right? So on the neurotic side, you have sometimes I hate myself, but then also so happy. So it's like this entire spectrum of emotions. And on the stable side, first of all, you have business administrations. Those are just like the Zen people. But you also have something like skydiving, which I think is an interesting one when you think of causality, right? It's probably the fact that jumping out of an airplane is not that much fun when you're extremely neurotic. So you have to be somewhat emotionally stable to enjoy these activities. So it's like an interesting way into people's psychology and the way that we think about causality here. Now, there's also and this is pretty controversial on many levels, but this is, I think, some of the latest work where they look at both the pictures that people post and people's faces. And the reason for why I'm pulling this up here, so this is essentially the AI dreaming of extroverts and introverts. So those are the faces, the 10 most, morph of the 10 most extroverted and 10 most introverted faces. And again, you actually see differences, right? So if you look at the introverted one, first of all, you see the outline of glasses because as we saw before, they're reading a lot more than the extroverts. You also see that extroverts probably do a bit more grooming because they have lighter hair. No genetic reason for why this should be the case. Bluer eyes. So if they wear contact lenses, they might just pop in colored ones. You also see that they're smiling. And it turns out that I think extroverted have figured out how to take good pictures. Because the extroverts, you don't see the nostrils, right? So extroverts probably do the duck face from above, whereas introverts, they just don't care and just take it from any angle. But again, the reason for why I think if that's true, it's interesting is that you can't leave your face at home, right? So like you could say, I don't want to be tracked and I'm going to leave my phone at home. I'm not going to use my credit card, even though that's really difficult these days. With a face, there's essentially not much that you can do. And oftentimes you show up in the pictures of other people, right? It's not even the stuff that you post, but you might just be walking in the background and you can make similar inferences. Now, the question is, how accurate are some of the predictions that we can make, right? So far it's only been examples. And I could throw numbers at you and say, well, the correlation between your self-report and my prediction is a 0.5. That doesn't mean anything, right? You don't really know if that's good or bad. And so one of my colleagues at Cambridge had I think a really nice way of comparing or at least capturing the accuracy of an algorithm. So what she did is she said, like, well, let's kind of see how good the computer is at predicting my personality and compare it to other people in my environment who should actually know me pretty well. So what she did is she looked at people's coworkers, friends, family members, and spouses. So I completed my own personality questionnaire, and then we just ask other people who should know me fairly well to complete the same questionnaire on my behalf. And now we can actually see, well, how good is a computer compared to other humans who should know us pretty well. And I should say this one was done in 2014, so quite a while ago. And it was only based on Facebook pages that people followed. So you can imagine accuracy with more data, better algorithms, and kind of more data sources actually goes up. But what she showed back in 2014 already was that a computer only needs 10 likes to be better than colleagues, right? In a way that's you guys who went to business school together. And 65 likes to be better than a friend, 120 likes to be better than family members. And that includes parents, kids, siblings. So those are people who spend a considerate amount of time with you. And then 300 likes to be better than the spouse. Back in the day, I should say the average number of likes in the data set was 230. So back in the day, the computer was already better just based on your Facebook likes at estimating your personality than colleagues, friend, and family. It was slightly worse than the spouse. But again, my prediction is if you add in all of the other data and have more sophisticated models, it would probably outperform the spouse as well. So these data traces are just incredibly intimate, right? It's not just a GPS record, and it's not just something that you tweet, but it really kind of gives others these insights into who you are on the inside. Now, fast forward, so this was stuff that we did 10, 15 years ago. You can't give a talk on this topic without mentioning ChatGPT, so my apologies, here it comes. But on some level, the interesting part, and which is also when we talk about the good and the bad, a somewhat terrifying part, is that back in the day, we used to have a data set, right? To kind of build our models, we needed a data set that had someone's digital traces combined with their psychology. We have to build a model. So it's all in a way proprietary and somewhat limited in scope. Now you can just do the same thing with ChatGPT. So this is some of the latest work that we've done with some of my students, where we just give ChatGPT access to your social media profile and say, hey, here's the Facebook status updates of a person. What do you think? Are they more extroverted, introverted? And the accuracy by which you can make those predictions is pretty much the same as in our supervised approach. So again, that means that a 15-year-old kid somewhere in the basement of their parents' home can now predict the psychological profiles of millions of people just by scraping the web. Again, somewhat democratizes access, but it's also certainly a bit terrifying. Okay, second part. So what part? So the first one was really just, okay, there's like getting access to someone's data actually gives us a pretty intimate insight into who they are. Why does it matter, right? If I now get access to, if I know if you're extroverted or introverted, why should I care? And one of the reasons, and this is again coming back to this analogy of the village, like the neighbors, it was interesting for them to poke around in my psychology. It was more interesting for them to try and push me in a certain direction and get me to date people, kind of not go to a certain party and so on. So it's like really about influencing behavior. And that might not come as a surprise, right? If you look at the big companies, they, first of all, spend a fortune on personalized recommendation, and they also make a fortune based on these personalized recommendations. So in this case, Netflix, over 150 million annual budget for these personalized recommendations, and almost all, not almost all of it, but the majority of the content that is watched on Netflix comes from these recommendations. Same with Amazon. Most of their purchases are actually generated by the recommendations that Amazon makes, right? The people who bought X also bought Y. And what I think is interesting is that oftentimes we don't even think of it as advertising, right? In that case, when you ask people about Amazon's people who bought X also bought Y, they usually think of it as advice. It's just like we're trying to help you find the stuff that you're looking for. Okay, so now coming back to psychology, because I said in the beginning, we can make inferences about your personality, and then maybe we can use that to shift your behavior. Now, when I started, the question was, how do you actually use that, right? So if you go to Facebook or Google, and there's no way that you can explicitly target people based on their personality. So there's no way that you can say, I want extroverts or I want introverts, and it's not because Facebook doesn't know how to do it, right? So I remember when the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke and Facebook was like, oh my God, how could this have happened? And you kind of look back and you see that they filed a patent in 2015, like making pretty much the exact same predictions here about people's personalities. So it's just that they're not offering this option. However, what you can do, so this is a screenshot from the targeting platform on Facebook. Anyone who has an account can run ads. And you can see it has the usual social demographics, right? You can target people based on age, gender. But what you can also do is you can target them based on interests. And now, if you kind of think back to the list of likes that I showed you, I know empirically from my data set that there's certain likes that are strongly correlated with being extroverted, and they're strongly correlated with being introverted. And now what I can do is I can essentially tell Facebook, I want my ad to only be sent out to people who are connected to at least one of these likes. And it's a very crude way of targeting, right? Because I'm sure that there's like many misunderstood introverts in the extroverted condition and so on and so forth. But it just means that you now have an audience that, at least on average, is more likely to be extroverted and more likely to be introverted. So this is what we did for our initial studies. And we've shown this across many different contexts, but one of the early studies that we did is that we teamed up with a UT retailer in the UK. And the goal was essentially to show a Facebook ad, get women to click on the ad, go to the website and purchase something. So we were totally agnostic in terms of what they bought. We just wanted to funnel them to the website and get them to make a purchase. And the idea that we had is essentially saying, well, it's exactly the same product, right? We're just advertising a beauty retailer, but can we frame what the beauty retailer has to offer depending on someone's personality? So in this case, we teamed up with their creative team. So it was copywriters who came up with 5 extroverted ads. And you can see there was like always something going on. It was exciting, stimulating. I think the copy said something like dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then you had the introverted ones was like much more reserved and quiet. So usually just one person. And then what we did is we essentially kind of targeted these different ad versions at both extroverts and introverts. And what you saw, which I actually was pretty surprised by, that the effect was that big. It was like a 50% uptake in this case, conversions or purchases compared to the mismatching condition, which is also like you could do the same thing for return on investment. And that's a pretty substantial effect for the fact that it was a super crude way of targeting, right? Again, we didn't predict someone's profile and then kind of depending on that, gave them the best matching ad. We just defined these broad audiences. And also we only tailored the one ad that people saw. So once they went to the website, it looked the same for everybody. So it was like a pretty remarkable effect for the study design that we put out there. And it really kind of shows that once you understand someone's psychology, right, and you don't need their input because you can just passively predict those psychological traits, you can actually influence their behavior in a way that you want. Now, not super surprisingly, I already mentioned that generative AI captures this first part, right? It can take your digital footprint, make predictions, and it's incredibly good at automating the second part. So we had to, back in the day, work with the creative team. That was always the limiting factor, right? The reason for why we didn't personalize the website was because we couldn't have humans come up with a million different versions for a million different people on all of the parts of the website. Now, generative AI is doing an incredible job. You don't have to read this, but this is a study that we recently did, and we essentially just told ChatGPT, write a short ad for Weekend Getaway to Rome that's tailored to a person who scores high on the Big 5 personality trait of openness. You don't even have to explain what openness means, right? Because it's read the entire internet, knows everything about psychology. So it can easily tailor to personality traits, moral values, like political ideology, and it does a pretty remarkable job. So when you kind of give it this instruction to tailor to openness, it talks about like curiosity, exploring the city. If you were to tailor to the lower end of openness, it just kind of talks about the tried and tested ways, the paths well trodden. So it's really kind of is good at capturing people's personality. And we also show, again, the same way that we did this with a beauty retailer, that once you personalize, people think of the message as more persuasive. They're more willing to spend money on going to the trip. And it essentially just kind of becomes a lot more effective, the messaging. Now, this is, I would say, really the starting point of what generative AI can do in this space. So it's nice because it generates text and it makes sense when you read it, but it's still pretty far away from where I think we're going to go in the very near future. And I just want to show you something that totally blew my mind and wasn't available when I finished writing the book, but it's a trailer for a James Bond movie. The movie doesn't exist. So the entire trailer was both written and essentially screened, created by AI. So the actors never played in the trailer that you're gonna see. Everything was essentially created by AI, and it's absolutely remarkable. You sometimes see, like when you look at the eyes of the people, that they're not real, but it's so realistic that I think this is where we're going to go in the future, right? So forget about the text. I could create a James Bond movie trailer that's specifically tailored to you. So let's see if this works. But it's just incredibly remarkable what happened within tech support. Thank you. What happened in this like short period of time, right? We started with the chat interface, and now, oh, you want to get? We can do it this way. So cool.
like the others. We can have much more than anyone else. The problem is that the world is too small. For both of us. Hello, James Bond.
What makes you think this is my first time? I just want to remind you. That I never miss.
In that movie, also raised terrible concerns about IP. But this is really, I think, where we're going, right? So the text was kind of cutesy and it works in increasing effectiveness, but like with AI being able to create these movies essentially from scratch, it's a whole different ballpark. Okay, now the big question, is this a good or bad thing? I don't think it will come as a surprise that I think it very much depends, right? So if you think about the fact that this allows us to be manipulated behind the scenes without us ever knowing that this is happening, right? Someone can get access to all of my data, make these inferences, influence the decisions that I'm making. It's not just that we're losing privacy, we're also losing, in a way, agency and self-determination, right? Because the choices that we make are no longer really our own if someone is pulling the strings behind our backs. And you see this playing out in different contexts. So you might have heard of the social scoring in China, which is like one of the biggest application of these types of both data tracking with real implication for people's behavior. So if, for example, your data says that you might be likely to protest, you might not be allowed to enter Beijing anymore. So this is something that really impacts people's lives, and it's not just an intrusion of privacy. I'm sure that you've all heard of Cambridge Analytica, which is another example, right? Where like being able to peek into your psychology and potentially shift your behavior is not just affecting you, it might affect the entire course of society. So I think that the downsides are really obvious, and they're also like plastered across the media in various contexts. What I do think, and this is something that I try to highlight in the book, there's like an entire chapter that I call the what if chapter. What if we kind of use it in a different way? Because there's this quote that I really like of Melvin Kranzberg, who's a tech historian. And what he said is like technology is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. And I think this last part is actually the really interesting one, right? Because if it's not neutral, it really depends on us. So it depends on leadership. And there's so many examples where you can use the same technology to actually help people accomplish goals that they have, and they're just like really difficult to do. So for example, we have like one study where we try to flip almost a beauty retailer on its head and say, well, instead of getting people to spend their money, can we use the same principle to help them save? So in this case, we teamed up with a fintech application on the West Coast, and they're trying to get people with very low levels of saving to save more. So in this case, we only looked at people with less than $100 in saving. So the US is like still, I think about 10% of people couldn't even go a week without being paid. So there's like this huge need for people to put more money to the side. And same idea. So we kind of predicted their personality traits, and then we changed the way that we communicated with them, the way that we encouraged them to save. And you saw like a 60% uptake in people who managed to hit their saving goals. Again, still pretty far from getting everybody to accomplish these goals, but certainly a nice step in the right direction. And then there's all of these other dimensions. Mental health, you can imagine. There's both ways in which you can track people's mental health. So some of the work that we've done in my lab is actually using smartphones to see if we can detect early signs of depression. So if we see from your GPS records, for example, that you don't leave your house as much anymore, there's much less physical activity, maybe you're not making and taking calls as much anymore. It might be nothing, right? Maybe we're just on vacation, but it could be an early warning sign that you might be entering a depression, and now we can actually intervene. And if you know that I think for every 100,000 people who are looking for a therapist, there's essentially 13. So there's like this huge gap between supply and demand. And with generative AI becoming better and better, you could imagine that at least for the people who don't have access to a traditional therapist, there might be ways in which you can engage them at the right moment with the right treatment. So I think there's just a lot of potential to use it in a positive way. Final one, and then I'm very happy to kind of open the floor. This question of what now, right? So if we say there's a technology that can be used for good and bad, how do we actually think about regulating it and making it work for people instead of making it work against them? And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about personally, because I was involved in like just talking and to the European Commission before they put out the GDPR, which is one of the strictest data protection regulations. And most of these regulations that you have right now, both on AI and personal data, they very much focus on transparency and control. So the idea is that we should tell people what's happening with their data and then give them the control to manage it. And that sounds like a great idea. And I agree that we should give people control. But I do think that the way that the ecosystem currently works, it's not necessarily right, but a responsibility that we're not really good at taking on. And the way that I've been thinking about this is that essentially, if you're like the captain of your own sailing boat, like essentially you're being in charge of your sailing boat, that's amazing if you're in the Mediterranean Sea. But if there's the weather is nice, the sea is calm, you can only make good choices because wherever you go, it's really nice. Being in charge of your own boat, fantastic. Oh, this is, by the way, generated by DALL-E, and you can see, it made me very happy because you can see how it messed up the leg and the steering wheel. So I was like, we do have an edge still as humans over AI. And so that's why I decided to keep it, just because it makes me feel good. Oh, it's a dumb captain, even though he would have to be pretty good at putting his leg through like this. Anyway, so what I was trying to show here is I don't think that that's the environment, right? I don't think the data environment is very similar to the Mediterranean Sea. I think it's much more of a raging thunderstorm. So there's like a zillion emergencies at the same time. But you would, if you were truly managing your own personal data, you would have to have incredible knowledge and expertise, constantly be up to date. So I do this for a living and I can't keep track of the technologies that are being put out and what happens with my data. And even if you know, it's a full-time job, right? So we have better stuff to do. And then just kind of going through all of the terms and conditions, kind of making sure that you're not potentially signing away data in a way that you shouldn't. So I just feel like in the current system, it's much more of a burden to be in control and in charge of your own boat. And it in a way lets the people who abuse your data off the hook, right? If the GDPR, the data protection regulations say, well, it's your responsibility to manage your data effectively, then it's in a way says like, well, Facebook and Google and Apple, not your responsibility, right? Because we just put the user in charge. So there's two things that I believe need to happen if we want to change that and actually help people master the control that they get. One is tame the sea. So that I think of as regulation, right? How do you make it easy for people to do the right thing and harder for companies to do the wrong thing? Could be as simple as change the default, right? If the default is no longer you're being tracked and you have to now opt out, nobody's going to do it, right? Because humans are lazy and we have other stuff to do. If that was reversed, now companies suddenly have to convince you that by using your data, they're actually doing such an incredible job at making the products better that you're happy to share it. Could also mean putting a data tax, for example, on companies. Right now, it's not costly to collect as much data as you want, even if you're not using it. If there was something like a data tax, maybe companies would think twice about whether they really need it. And then the second piece, and this is the one that I'm probably more excited by, just because it's much easier to implement in a speedy way, and it also optimizes utility for individuals. So regulation, right, is like essentially it's trying to minimize risks of data abuse, but it's not necessarily helping make the most of their data. So the competent crew brings us back to the village that I started with, because what happened there, so essentially you kind of see the vineyards here, and my family, when I was growing up, we had like a couple of vineyards, but certainly not enough to produce our own wine. But first of all, we didn't have enough grapes, and we also had no idea what we were doing. And so we could have just let them rot or eat them. But what happens in these regions is usually people get to get them. So there's a lot of families who own like these small parcels of land, and they come together in wine co-ops. So you pool the grapes, and now you have a lot more negotiation power, for example, to go to the big wineries and say, hey, you just collectively buy all of our grapes. Or some co-ops even have their own winemakers. So because you're now many people, you can hire experts to produce the wine. And the same way that we did this in the village with grapes, you can think of data co-ops or data trusts as communities of people who have a shared interest in using their data. The example that I've started giving, because it's so top of mind for me, is expecting moms, right? If you're expecting a baby, there's like, you want to know exactly how do my genetic factors, my medical history, my environmental factors, my social factors, how do they influence whether I'm healthy and whether the baby's healthy? And you want it as like a continuous measure that is like every day with recommendations of what to do. Now, you could very nicely get this if all of the expecting moms around the world would pool all of their data, right? If you can see all of the genetic data, all of the environmental factors, it would be relatively easy to build these predictive models and say, here's exactly what you should be doing in your situation, giving your background to make sure that you're healthy and the baby's healthy. Now, do I want my genetic data to be out there for pharma companies? Probably not, right? Because it's like, think of genetic data as super intimate. You're not just signing away your own genetic code, you're also signing away half of the genetic code of like siblings and so on. So instead of giving it to one entity that collects it centrally, you could actually come together as a data corp and data trust. And the idea is that it's member owned, right? As a data corp, same with the winery, it's owned by the members. And because you now many people, first of all, your data becomes a lot more valuable, and you can put management in place that knows what they're doing, right? So because there are many members, you can now hire experts who can try and manage the data for you, build these models, and they should have fiduciary responsibilities. So the same way that we do this in banking, right? We understand that not everybody is in a good position to manage their own finances. So now the people doing it on your behalf, they are legally obligated to act in your best interest. And the same could be true for data co-ops. And now I think it's a totally different system, right? It's no longer just minimizing risk, but you're really trying to help everybody make the most of their data by saying, let's try and figure out what you want to learn, whether that's insights, whether it's monetizing it. And we're just going to build a community around that allows you to do that. There's already some data corps that like this that exist in Switzerland, for example, that work on some of the rare diseases that are not necessarily covered by pharma. And they seem to be working pretty well. So I think we're going to see a lot more of them in the future. And with that, it was a high-speed tour through like a 10-year research agenda. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions. Okay. I will.
So we have an opportunity for question and answers now. I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone so that people who are watching us on streaming can also hear your question. You had your hand up first.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Thank you, Columbia, for organizing this. Much more fun than watching TED Talks and so on. You mentioned in one of the sideways or directions that one can explore this, you mentioned career. Taking it to the individual level, can one as an individual take advantage of all this information available to know oneself better, perhaps, or to confirm some of these personality tests, perhaps, that one took while at business school? I don't know, to see if this has changed and how this could potentially affect one's career or one's next career step, or maybe putting it at an organizational level. Can this help perhaps the people and culture area to know better what is happening in the company, who is happier? How can you practically make somebody be their best at work, or make teams work better at individual or company level, small organization level? Can this be in practice be used for free without hiring a full study?
I love the question. And so I totally think that's the case, especially with the new models, right? So back in the day, I was part of a startup that tried exactly to do that. So what we said is like, well, companies have access to all of these models. At the very least, I want users to have free access to, right? So you can take all of your Google data, you can take your Facebook, whatever it is, you run it through our models and we give you a prediction. The reason for why we set this up initially was that our hope was that, oh, again, almost. Well, I'm just going to continue. I think not much was lost. This is like very funny because it has like a red circle and now it's green, so that makes sense. But the idea of the company was essentially to give you insights into your data with the goal of kind of getting people to value their data more. Because the argument that we made is essentially like, if you don't know how much your data is worth, you're not going to demand policies, you're not going to kind of force companies to give you more control. And I think it was interesting for people to see, like play around with the data and get these insights. Changed nothing, and we did a study on this. It changed nothing in terms of how willing they were to give it away. Because our hope was like, once you understand how intimate it is, people are much less likely to give it away. And I think that's when I became a little bit less optimistic about this entire transparency and control. But I do think it's true that once you give people access, and ideally what you would have sitting on top is recommendations, right? Because if you just give people insights into here's your personality, then the question is like, okay, what do I do with it? What does it mean for my career? And I think it's become a lot easier with the transformer models because they're very flexible, right? Back in the day, I would have to train a model that says, I'm going to predict your personality. And now there's another model that sits on top and it says, here's what you're going to do with it in terms of career. With the new transformer models in ChatGPT, you can essentially, even though it's never been trained to do that, you can input all of the data. And I've tried this in many different contexts. It works pretty beautifully. And just say like, look, try and give me some recommendations for what I should be doing. And maybe while you're on it, also tell me why that's the case. So it's like a really nice way of probing the model and say, why are you making these recommendations? Which is something that was much harder for us to do, right? So we might have told you, well, based on everything that we know about you from your data, we think that you're more extroverted, and that's why a sales role would be great for you. But that was also the extent of explanation. So with the new models, you can essentially kind of drill deeper and deeper and deeper and say, okay, where's this coming from? Which of the data points? What might be challenges based on my profile? So I think that allows us to have like a much more one-to-one interaction with some of these data points. For organizations, I think it's the same. I've been just like from an academic side, it's been really tricky to study organizations just because with consumers, it's easy. Everybody's happy to give consumer data. Organizational data, internal is much harder because everybody's worried about IP, right? So you can tell companies, you don't need to send me your data. Let me kind of send you some of the models. And I can look at, for example, you mentioned mental health, right? So you could see like who is potentially struggling. What are some of the goals that your employees might have that you can tap into and make their work life or like satisfaction kind of spike? Much harder because companies are so guarded. But I do think we might see this change as we get like models that don't necessarily require the pulling of all data, but you just send the intelligence to the company. And there's really fun and interesting research. So one of the papers that I really like that's coming out of Stanford is they looked at people's emails. So they actually got access, freaking Stanford people. They were trying to predict whether people are either voluntarily leaving the company or being fired. And one of the things that they found, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it as culture, is to what extent does the way that you talk in terms of linguistic style, in terms of content, start to deviate from how everybody else on the team talks and the organization. And it's almost like a measure of culture fit. So you see, like once you start to talk in a different way, either you leave voluntarily because I think you just realize that you don't fit in as much anymore, or you get fired because they realize that you don't fit in as much anymore. And so I think there's really interesting ways in which you can probe organizational data. It's not easy to do this from an outside academic perspective. If anyone has company data, let me know.
Thank you for your presentation, Sandra. I'm more likely in the other side of the trench.
Yeah.
I'm a high school teacher. I promote critical knowledge in my students. So stay out of the algorithm, use their own brains, uh, choose to use their phones wisely. But that's not about my question. It's just about context. Um, when I look at the first impression of dichotomy of introvert and extrovert, I'm more likely introvert, but I like to be at game conventions, which are a lot of people. I enjoy role playing games and things like that. That very,
Role-playing is the number one predictor of introversion, so you got it.
but you are actually interacting with other people you don't know.
Well, introverts is not that introverts hate other people. Introverts just have like very intimate relationships. It's not that you want to hang out with 20 other people. But
Well, but if you ask me the question, if I enjoy knowing a lot of people in parties,
Mhm.
I'm more likely that the question won't fit me because I won't go to parties.
Yeah.
At least you consider a game convention is a party. So there's a cultural bias associated. Like you were saying, this how come your model can extend to that? And that's the first question. And the second question is, how can you compare? Do you have a control group of people which are outside the ecosystem, the digital ecosystem, which has no digital print and such? And if you don't have a control group, how can you make an unbiased prediction about your model?
Great question. I'm going to start with the second one. So the second question was essentially to what extent is the group that I have digital footprints for different to the group that doesn't have? And there you can actually, at least when you think about it in terms of personality traits, right? It's relatively easy to compare the distribution in terms of personality traits of your study sample, which has like the digital footprints, to the general population, where we do have a lot of normative data, and it looks pretty much the same. So I think it's still a question of, is the fact that someone is not on social media also a signal, right? So the fact that you might be very conscientious, like organized, you might also be super neurotic if you're not on social media, just because you understand that it might be a data grabbing platform. So I think the fact that Facebook, for example, has data not just on their users, but also on the non-users, just means that there's of you not using it, you also send a signal to whoever is looking at the data. But yeah, generally speaking, in terms of the personality distribution, it looks pretty much the same. It's also because the samples are so big, right? So you could also say, well, there's older people are underrepresented in our samples, or people from certain parts of the world are underrepresented. But because they're so large, it's really easy to stratify. So if you want to build a model that's most accurate for older people, you still have like 10,000 in some of these data sets. The second question, which I think is an interesting one, is to what extent is the right? You said like in your mind, like going to the role playing gathering convention is a party, and this is actually one of the reasons for why traditional self-report questionnaires are sometimes tricky to uncover some of these, like let's say cross-cultural differences, for example. Like oftentimes you don't find cross-cultural differences because the way that we respond to these questions is always relative to the people around us, right? So when I was at Cambridge getting my PhD, I was in a group of like computer scientists, and it was a nerd fest, right? So back in Cambridge, if you give me a questionnaire, I say like, oh my God, I'm so extroverted. I see at least 5 people a week compared to all of my other people. Then I go to Columbia Business School and I'm suddenly on the very low end of the distribution, right? So now you give me a questionnaire and I think of myself as much more introverted compared to all of the marketing folks in the business school. And so typically you don't see these differences cross-cultural or effects like homophily. So there's like there was always like theorized that people who are similar in terms of their personality, in terms of their values, are more likely to become friends and are more likely to date. And it was really tricky to find that in self-report questioning because it's like a contrast, right? So if I think of myself like as opposed to my husband, more introverted. And if I think of myself as like opposed to some of my friends, maybe more extroverted. Now that we have the more objective data lens, you actually see these differences emerge. So you kind of see the homophily effects that we always theorized but could never find. You see cross-cultural differences. So I think it's like one way in which you can actually pick up on these differences. And even though in your mind, that sounds like, even though you might think of like going to the convention as a party, it's still much less extroverted than someone going to a rave with like 1,000 other people, and it's just like a day long event. So I think that's like a nice way of actually leveraging data because it gives you a more objective version of this. And I'm glad that someone is trying to educate the young people, by the way. So, yeah. Good luck.
Thank you for the presentation. My question actually builds on the previous one. So I would like to know how do you think the future would look like in terms of who wins this race of predicting uh, uh, not just personality but actions of, or the way that people will behaviors, right? So is it the one who gathers the most data, so it ends up with a monopoly, or is there this hyper segmentation requires more of a focus approach, so you see more of a local data networks, like winning the race because they're able to really understand maybe a smaller population, but like much better than just the larger data set?
Yeah.
How do you see that trade-off?
I think it's a great question, and we don't fully know yet. So I think even with the models that we're training right now, right? If you think about transformer models and OpenAI, it's trained on the entire internet. Now, first of all, it's very much not sustainable because it just takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of money to train these models. And there's quite a few arguments coming from computer scientists that you could have much better, like smaller models that are trained on better data, right? If you think about news, for example, so I know the New York Times has like someone who's thinking about data, and their argument is we could have much better models if we just have high quality content in a specific context, right? So in this case, we're now talking about the model itself, not the person, but I think it's like a similar idea. The same is true for making these data predictions with people, because technically speaking, right, one of the arguments that you oftentimes hear from people outside of psychology, which is also true, is they say, well, why do you actually have to go through psychology? Why don't you just kind of take someone's data and make a prediction of their future behavior, right? So if you go from past behavior to future behavior, you only have one prediction, which also means that there's only one path that you make errors on. Because right now, there's like error going from your behavior to personality, there's prediction error, and then there's prediction error going from personality to behavior again. And the one reason for why this personality or like the psychology piece might actually be interesting is that it might focus the attention of a model, for example. So let's say I get access to your entire social media history, and I say, well, just make a recommendation for a weekend in New York that kind of is personalized. It's not entirely clear what the model is going to pick up on, right? Because there's a gazillion different options. And what we know is that oftentimes these models just kind of pick one thing and they go down like a freaking deep rabbit hole. But that's only a tiny sliver of who you are. So there might be, and again, we're kind of trying to test that right now. There might be something that even though there's a prediction error going to psychology, what it does, it focuses the attention of the model on the right things. And that actually then makes the prediction to future behavior better. And so you might be able to gain something by losing information. But I think it's a question that we don't know yet, is who's going to win it. And my intuition is that because we now have these models that are relatively broad, is that it's been democratized a little bit more than it used to be the case. But who knows? Like if OpenAI pulls access to the API, there's a gazillion businesses out of business tomorrow. So not sure to what extent it's really democratized.
We have time for one more question. Francisca.
Thank you. I have a question that it's not very business oriented, but more parent oriented.
Yeah.
I have seen that like our generation, our behavior online is very different than the one from teenagers. Like we have a real life personality, and then we behave online sort of consistently.
Yeah.
But in teenagers, I have seen that they develop a digital personality sort of like in parallel to their like real life presence or how they behave at home, etc. Have you double clicked on that in your studies, and is that real or just like a
It's, I mean, super interesting. First of all, like one of the things that I was recently told by like one of the youngsters, like in real life doesn't exist because even online is in real life for us. I'm like, okay, I got it. So I was scolded for using in real life. But it's an interesting question, right? Even in like the traditional setting, there's always this argument that, well, what you do online, it doesn't necessarily reflect what you do offline. One of the counter arguments is, so sometimes, right, in some contexts it doesn't even matter if I get your true self or your ideal self. Like think of marketing. Like marketers are oftentimes trying to figure out who's the person that you want to be, and let's optimize for that because that's how we get you there. So I think for the young kids, even though they have like these two aspects, is still both part of their identity, and you might be optimizing for who they currently are or who they want to be. On the other side, if you really want to get an accurate reading, there's a distinction that psychologists make between identity claims and behavioral residue. So identity claims are all the explicit signals that you put out there, right? If you put something on Facebook, you put it out there because you want to signal to yourself and the world, this is who I am. So it's very intentional. But there's so many other data traces, right? The fact that you have your phone with you and that your GPS captures everything that you do, you have the call logs and everything else. You don't really intentionally put that out there. It's just a byproduct of you using technology. So the idea that you might be able to misrepresent on some level, but not on all levels. And most companies now have like this full 360 picture where they have like, here's who you want to be on social media, but here's also everything else. So if I was, my favorite example is always, if you're trying to be much more organized, right? Let's say we all want to be more organized when it comes to a job interview. We might be able to keep up that persona for a while on social media, but you still, like, one of the strongest predictors on the phone of whether you're organized or not is whether your phone runs out of battery. Happens to me all the time. And again, this is something that if you wanted to consistently counter that impression of you being a disorganized person, you would have to change your entire lifestyle. So there's the fact that there's like the explicit ones and the ones that are somewhat unintentional, that still gives you a slightly different picture. But I think it's interesting to see how this changes with the next generation. My intuition is that they would say that the online persona, even if it's somewhat different, is still part of how they think of themselves as a core identity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Matz, for this fascinating conversation. Thank you all for coming today. Let's give a round of applause.
Well, thanks to you. I know it's early, so I was impressed that you showed up. Thank you. Okay. Baby time.